Pain is something we all fear, and for some it becomes a nightmare that doesn't end quickly. In this video, we'll share 5 real stories of the most painful deaths of all time. These aren't just tragic endings, they are true accounts of people who endured unimaginable suffering. Moments where every second stretched into agony and survival became impossible. These stories push the limits of human pain and endurance, revealing how fragile life can be when faced with extreme torment. They are raw, heartbreaking, and deeply disturbing, and once you hear them, they're impossible to forget. In 1916, the name Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin carried a strange power of its own. To some, he was a holy man, a mystic, a healer, a conduit between God and the Russian Empire. To others, he was a monster hiding behind prayers, a peasant who had somehow wormed his way into the highest circle of power. Fear and fascination followed him everywhere, especially among the Russian nobility, who whispered his name in candlelit rooms and wondered how one man could hold such sway over the throne. Rasputin's rise was as unlikely as it was unsettling. Born into a poor peasant family in the remote Siberian village of Pokrovskoye, nothing about his early life suggested greatness or infamy. That changed in 1897, after a religious awakening sent him wandering across Russia in search of spiritual truth. He was never formally trained by the church, yet by the early 1900s, his intense gaze, hypnotic presence, and unshakable confidence had earned him a reputation as a mystic and faith healer. People listened when he spoke. People believed when he prayed. Everything shifted in 1905, when Rasputin was introduced to Emperor Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna. Their young son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a condition that made even minor injuries potentially fatal. Desperate and terrified, Alexandra clung to any hope she could find. When Rasputin appeared to ease the boy's suffering, whether through prayer, suggestion, or coincidence, it was enough. From that moment on, he became indispensable to the imperial family. But while the empress trusted him completely, the rest of the court watched in horror. Rasputin's influence only grew, especially after Nicholas left to oversee the military during World War I, leaving Alexandra and Rasputin at the center of political decision-making. As Russia suffered crushing defeats on the battlefield and unrest spread at home, many blamed the strange holy man whispering in the empress's ear. To the aristocracy, Rasputin wasn't a savior. He was a dangerous fraud, corrupting the monarchy from within. By 1916, the hatred had hardened into resolve. A group of powerful men decided that Rasputin had to die, for the sake of the crown and for Russia itself. On the night of December 30th, 1916, Rasputin was lured to the Moika Palace under false pretenses. Prince Felix Yusupov told him he would meet Yusupov's wife Irina. She was never there. Down in the palace basement, Rasputin was offered cakes and Madeira wine, all heavily laced with cyanide. Enough, the conspirators believed, to kill several men. He ate, he drank, and nothing happened. As minutes passed, then stretched longer, unease filled the room. Rasputin showed no signs of poisoning, no choking, no collapse, just an eerie calm. Panicked and frustrated, Yusupov retrieved a revolver and shot him in the chest. Rasputin fell to the floor, motionless. Certain it was over, the conspirators stepped away. Then, moments later, Rasputin stirred. When Yusupov returned to check the body, Rasputin suddenly lunged at him, clawing, staggering, his strength seemingly resurrected from death itself. He fled toward the palace courtyard, bleeding but alive. Chaos erupted. Another conspirator fired again, striking him. A final shot hit Rasputin in the forehead, ending the struggle at last. His body was wrapped in cloth, driven through the frozen streets of St. Petersburg, and dumped into the icy waters of the Little Nevka River from the Petrovsky Bridge. For most men, that would have been the end. For Rasputin, it was only the beginning of the legend. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed water was found in his lungs, suggesting he was still alive when he hit the river, drowning in the freezing darkness. Official autopsy reports later contradicted this, stating he died from gunshot wounds. with no evidence of poison or drowning. But the truth hardly mattered anymore. The story had taken on a life of its own, fueled by Yusupov's dramatic memoirs, which painted the murder as a supernatural battle between good and evil. Reactions to Rasputin's death split the nation. Within months, the Romanov dynasty collapsed. Centuries of imperial rule were swept away, and in death, Rasputin became something more than a man. His violent end sealed his place in history as a symbol of mysticism, decay, and the doomed final days of Imperial Russia. It was the morning of March 19, 2015, in Kabul, Afghanistan. 27-year-old Farkhunda Malikzada stepped out of her home with purpose and faith, heading to a Quran recitation class. She was a volunteer teacher, a devoted student of Islamic law, and a woman with clear dreams she hoped to become a judge one day. Before leaving, she reassured her mother, Bibi Hajera, that she would return soon to help prepare for the Afghan New Year celebrations. It was an ordinary goodbye. It would be the last time her mother heard her voice. On her way home, Farkhunda stopped at the Shah do Shamshira shrine. What began as a simple conversation quickly turned tense. She confronted the shrine's caretaker over the sale of amulets, openly criticizing the practice as superstition and contrary to Islamic teachings. The argument grew heated, and in a moment of anger, the caretaker made a devastating choice. He falsely accused her of burning the Quran. The accusation echoed through the courtyard like a spark in dry grass. Voices rose, people gathered. Farkhunda desperately denied the claim, repeating again and again that she was a Muslim, that she respected the Quran, that she would never commit such an act. But truth had no chance against rage. The lie spread faster than she could defend herself, feeding a growing mob driven by outrage and misunderstanding. The crowd turned violent. Farkhunda was dragged outside, beaten with sticks and stones as her cries for help went unanswered. Police arrived, but instead of shielding her, they hesitated, firing warning shots into the air, powerless or unwilling to confront the mob. At one point, officers moved her onto the roof of the mosque, possibly hoping to protect her. But objects rained down from below. She was struck, weakened, and fell back into the crowd. What followed was pure brutality. She was dragged through the streets, beaten again and again. A car drove over her body, dragging her along the road. Still, it didn't end. Her attackers pulled her to the Kabul River, where the assault continued. Finally, her broken body was set on fire. Some members of the crowd fed the flames with their own clothing. When her body resisted burning, they continued until nothing remained but horror. All of it was filmed, shared, watched. The world reacted in shock. The footage revealed a terrifying truth. This was not the act of extremists hiding in the shadows, but of ordinary people swept up by a false accusation and collective rage. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani condemned the killing, and investigations confirmed what Farkhunda had been screaming all along. There was no evidence against her. She was innocent. As the truth emerged, grief turned into fury. Thousands took to the streets, chanting her name. Women painted their faces red, symbolizing her blood. Her funeral became a historic moment. Women carried her coffin themselves, defying tradition in a powerful act of protest and remembrance. Justice, however, fell short. Although dozens were initially charged and several received harsh sentences, appeals reduced punishments and many were released. For Farkhunda's family and for activists, it felt like a second betrayal. The street where she was killed was later renamed in her honor. Her grave became a place of mourning, reflection, and resistance. For her mother, the pain never faded. She remembered identifying her daughter's burned and battered body, a memory no parent should ever endure. Yet, even in her grief, she stood strong, walking alongside other women who refused to let Farkhunda be forgotten. Farkhunda Malikzada's death exposed the deadly consequences of misinformation, misogyny, and mob violence, but her name also became a symbol of courage, of injustice, and of the urgent need for change. Her story reminds us how quickly a lie can kill, and how dangerous silence can be when humanity is on the line.
A 35-year-old woman died after falling into a meat grinder at a processing plant in northern Pennsylvania.
Jill Greninger was the kind of person whose presence filled a room without effort. At just 35 years old, she was a devoted mother, a loving partner, and a loyal friend. Someone deeply rooted in her family and defined by the care she gave to others. She lived in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where her world revolved around her 3 children. She was also eagerly awaiting a new chapter in her life, the arrival of her first grandchild. The future still felt wide open. And then, on the morning of April 22, 2019, everything stopped. That day began like any other. Jill reported to work at Economy Locker Storage Company, a food processing plant in Pennsdale, Pennsylvania that had been operating since the early 1900s. The facility specialized in meat processing, and Jill was doing her job focused, experienced, unaware that the routine rhythm of the workplace was about to turn deadly. Just before noon, around 11:40 a.m., she was standing on a set of movable stairs positioned beside an industrial meat grinder. The machine was massive, built to process enormous quantities of meat, and sat roughly 6 feet off the ground, forcing workers to operate at an elevated height. Then, something went terribly wrong. No one saw it happen. There were no direct witnesses. In a matter of seconds, Jill either slipped or was pulled into the grinder while performing her duties. The exact cause remains unknown. Lycoming County Coroner Charles Kiesling Jr. later suggested she may have been reaching into the machine when the accident occurred. Whatever the trigger, the outcome was immediate and irreversible. The first sign that something was wrong came from the machine itself. An employee nearby heard unusual noises that didn't belong in the normal hum of the plant. When they went to investigate, they were confronted with a scene so horrifying it stopped them cold. Emergency services were called immediately. Police officers and firefighters arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Jill was already gone. Volunteer firefighters spent more than 45 agonizing minutes dismantling the grinder piece by piece to recover her remains. It was a grueling, emotionally devastating process that left seasoned responders visibly shaken. The coroner later described the incident as horrible, emphasizing the sheer brutality of a death that occurred inside the moving parts of an active machine. As the shock rippled outward, family, friends, and co-workers struggled to comprehend the loss. Jill wasn't just another employee. She was a mother, a daughter, a partner, a woman whose life was built around showing up for the people she loved, cheering from the sidelines at her children's games, laughing during quiet nights at home, enjoying simple moments like playing shuffleboard with her partner, Jack. In the weeks that followed, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration launched an investigation. What they uncovered only deepened the tragedy. OSHA cited Economy Locker Storage Company for 11 serious safety violations, issuing fines totaling nearly $50,000. The findings pointed to failures in workplace protections that cost Jill her life. Though the company declined to comment, the investigation underscored a haunting truth. This death was not just an accident. It was preventable. Jill's passing marked the first fatality reported at the plant, but its impact reached far beyond its walls. Her parents, David and Linda Heller, her 5 siblings, her partner Jack, and her children, Sarah, Dominic, and John, were left to navigate a world forever changed. Friends described her as fun-loving, generous, and always willing to help. Someone who lit up every room she entered. Someone who gave everything she had to the people around her.
RCMP say they got word of an injured man at the summer carnival around 10:40 Tuesday night. Paramedics and firefighters rushed in, but he was pronounced at the scene.
It was August 16, 2003, at the Island County Fair on Whidbey Island, Washington. The afternoon felt perfect, warm summer air, laughter everywhere, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy drifting between colorful booths. Families crowded the midway, children tugged at their parents' hands, eager for rides. Among the fair's biggest attractions was the Super Loop 2, a small roller coaster with a single vertical loop that had thrilled riders for years. Behind the scenes, 40-year-old Doug McKay was working as he always did. Doug wasn't just an operator, he was a co-owner of Paradise Amusements, a family-run carnival business he had grown up in. From selling popcorn as a child to maintaining rides as an adult, the carnival was his life. He was known as experienced, confident, and deeply committed to keeping everything running smoothly for the families who came to enjoy the fair. That afternoon, Doug noticed the Super Loop 2 needed lubrication on part of its track. It was routine maintenance, something he had done countless times before. Confident in his skills and pressed by the steady flow of riders, he made a fateful decision. As Doug climbed onto the platform to apply the lubricant, something went wrong. In a split second, he lost his footing. Witnesses later recalled the horror that followed when his long hair became entangled in one of the moving carts. The ride didn't slow. It didn't stop. The cart yanked Doug violently into the air, dragging him along the track as screams erupted below. Fairgoers watched in disbelief as he was lifted as high as 40 feet, his body colliding with parts of the ride before being thrown clear. The moment ended with a sickening impact as Doug was hurled into a metal fence. The joy and noise of the fair vanished, replaced by panic, shock, and screams. Children were still on the ride when it happened. Some saw everything unfold just feet away. Others were splattered with blood, left frozen and terrified. Parents rushed forward, pulling their children close, trying to shield them from what they had just witnessed. One father, whose 12-year-old son had been riding the Super Loop 2, rushed him home before police could question him, desperate to wash away both the blood and the trauma. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Doug McKay had already died. Authorities later speculated that his hair or arm had been caught in the moving cart, but the exact details hardly mattered. The result was the same. A seasoned professional, a man who had spent his entire life around carnival rides, was gone in seconds. Shockingly, the fairgrounds resumed operations less than an hour later. The Super Loop 2 was shut down permanently, but the rest of the carnival reopened the following day. Doug's wife, Sherry, honored a promise she had once made to him to keep the business running no matter what. The rides continued, but the loss of Doug hung heavy over the fairgrounds and everyone who knew him. Doug left behind his wife and 3 children, Travis, Michelle, and Kelsey. He was remembered as tough but kind, a mentor who cared deeply about his crew and his family. His funeral, held 10 days later in Idaho, brought together loved ones to mourn a man whose life had been built around bringing joy to others. Doug McKay's death is a chilling reminder of how unforgiving high-risk environments can be, even for the most experienced professionals. One moment of routine, one split-second decision, and a life devoted to family and hard work was gone forever. In the summer of 1981, David Allen Kerwin was just 24 years old, full of energy and curiosity, the kind of person who never stayed still for long. He was a student at Pasadena City College, balancing his studies with construction work and managing apartment buildings, always juggling responsibility with adventure. When he wasn't working or studying, David was traveling, hiking, exploring the outdoors, chasing experiences wherever he could find them. He came from a close-knit family in La Cañada, Flint Ridge, California, and had a deep love for animals, especially dogs. His family owned 3, and David cared for them with genuine affection. That compassion, so central to who he was, would ultimately lead him into a moment he could never escape. In July, under a clear Yellowstone sky, David's camping trip was coming to an end. He had traveled through Northern California and Canada before meeting his friend Ronald Ratliff at Yellowstone National Park. With them was Ronald's dog, a mixed-breed boxer named Moosey. The day felt peaceful, almost unreal in its calm. On July 20th, the 2 men stopped at the Fountain Paint Pot thermal area, drawn in by the park's famous hot springs, beautiful, steaming pools that looked almost otherworldly. They stepped away from their truck just for a closer look. That's when everything changed. Without warning, Moosey broke free and sprinted toward Celestine Pool, a shimmering blue thermal spring, known for its beauty and for temperatures that often exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit. For reasons no one could explain, the dog leapt into the pool. Her screams shattered the quiet. Panic set in instantly. David and Ronald ran toward the edge as nearby visitors froze in disbelief. The water was boiling. The danger was obvious. Ronald shouted for David to stop, begging him not to go in. But David was already beyond hesitation. He was watching an animal suffer, and his instincts took over. Ignoring every warning, David stepped into the scalding water and dove headfirst into the pool. The moment his body entered the near-boiling spring, his fate was sealed. He fought through the pain, swimming toward Musi, reaching her, trying desperately to pull her back, but the heat was overwhelming. After releasing the dog, David struggled to resurface. Ronald rushed forward, burning his own feet as he pulled David from the water. By the time witnesses gathered around, the damage was horrifying. David's skin had turned pale. His hair fell out in clumps. He had lost his vision. When someone tried to remove his shoes, his skin peeled away with the fabric, revealing third-degree burns beneath. His entire body, over 100%, had been catastrophically burned. Amazingly, David remained conscious. He was in unbearable pain, aware of what was happening, reportedly acknowledging the recklessness of his choice, even as his body failed him. Emergency crews rushed him to the West Yellowstone Airport, where he was airlifted to the Intermountain Burn Center in Salt Lake City. Doctors fought to save him, but the injuries were too severe. After enduring hours of unimaginable agony, David Allen Kerwin died the following morning. Musi did not survive either. She succumbed almost instantly. Her body never recovered from the pool. It was September 30th, 1999, in Tokaimura, Japan, a quiet town northeast of Tokyo where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. Inside a uranium processing facility, 3 workers began what they believed would be a routine shift. They had no idea that before the day ended, they would trigger one of the most horrifying nuclear accidents in modern history, one that would slowly and painfully destroy the human body from the inside out. The facility, operated by the Japan Nuclear Fuel Conversion Company, was under pressure to meet a shipping deadline. To save time, the workers Hisashi Uchi, Masato Shinohara, and Yutaka Yokokawa made a decision that would haunt the world. Instead of following strict safety procedures, they bypassed them entirely. Using stainless steel buckets, they poured enriched uranium into a tank that was never designed to handle it. The tank's safe limit was 2.4 kilograms. They poured in more than 6 times that amount. At 10:30 a.m., the room was suddenly filled with a blinding blue-white flash. In that instant, an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction began. Radiation flooded the facility, invisible, silent, and lethal. The men didn't immediately understand what had happened, but their bodies did. Hisashi Uchi, standing closest to the tank, absorbed an unimaginable dose of radiation far beyond what the human body can survive. Within moments, the damage was already irreversible. The effects were immediate and terrifying. Nausea, confusion, and intense pain overtook them. Uchi began vomiting uncontrollably as alarms screamed through the building. The plant was evacuated, and emergency crews rushed in, but the radiation had already done its work. The men were transported to a hospital in Tokyo, where doctors quickly realized they were facing something they had never seen before. For Uchi, the suffering that followed was beyond comprehension. The radiation destroyed his immune system entirely. His body lost the ability to repair itself, his skin deteriorated, his organs began to fail, and his white blood cell count dropped to nearly 0. Even the smallest infection became a deadly threat. Day after day, his condition worsened, yet he was repeatedly resuscitated whenever his heart stopped, kept alive as his body continued to break down. His pain was constant, his suffering relentless. For 83 days, Uchi endured what many consider the most painful, medically documented death in history. On December 21, 1999, his body finally gave out, and he died from multiple organ failure. Masato Shinohara, who had also received a massive dose of radiation, fought for months before succumbing on April 27, 2000. Yutaka Yokokawa, farther from the source, survived, but his life was permanently altered by long-term health complications. The damage didn't stop with them. More than 10,000 residents in the surrounding area were tested for radiation exposure. Hundreds were found to have been exposed above safety limits. Fear spread through the town. Businesses suffered, and public trust collapsed. The accident sent shockwaves across Japan. The company faced severe consequences, criminal charges, massive financial penalties, and a permanent shutdown of the facility. Laws were rewritten, safety regulations tightened, and the Tokaimura accident was classified as a major nuclear event. But for many, none of it felt like enough. This disaster wasn't caused by an explosion or a natural catastrophe. It was caused by human shortcuts, ignored warnings, and a belief that nothing would go wrong.
Susan Smith is being arraigned in Union, South Carolina this morning, one day after police say she confessed to murdering her 2 young sons.
In late October 1994, Union, South Carolina, was gripped by a story that seemed ripped from a nightmare. Susan Lee Smith, just 23 years old, appeared on national television, tears streaming down her face, pleading desperately for the safe return of her 2 young sons, Michael, 3, and Alexander, just 14 months old. Her voice trembled as she described the terror of being carjacked at gunpoint by a stranger, a black man who had driven off with her children in the back seat of her 1990 Mazda Protege. The community rallied behind her, lighting candles, posting flyers, and joining a massive manhunt that stretched over 9 tense days. Every heart in Union beat with hope, praying for the boys' safe return. But the hope was a cruel illusion. Almost immediately, investigators began to notice cracks in Susan's story. Her account of the carjacking didn't add up. She claimed to have stopped at a red light at an isolated intersection, but traffic analysis showed the light would not have turned red unless another car had been present. A polygraph exam revealed further inconsistencies, and detectives quietly shifted their focus, scouring nearby lakes and ponds. The tension grew unbearable, and fear mingled with confusion. What had really happened to Michael and Alexander? 9 days after the boys were reported missing, the chilling truth emerged. Susan confessed. She had driven her car to a boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, released the parking brake, and allowed the vehicle to roll into the water, with her children strapped inside. For 6 agonizing minutes, the car floated before slowly sinking into the dark lake. Susan watched. She made no move to save them. When the car was eventually retrieved, the scene was unbearable. Michael and Alexander were still in their car seats, alongside Susan's wedding dress and a family photo album, symbols of the life she had so deliberately chosen to discard. Law enforcement officers, hardened to tragedy, could barely hold back tears. The mother who had begged the nation for help had, in truth, taken the lives of her own children. The motive behind Susan's horrific act was later revealed. She had been pursuing a romantic relationship with Tom Finley, the wealthy son of her employer. When he ended the relationship, stating he did not want children, Susan made a chilling decision. Her sons were an obstacle to the life she wanted, and she resolved to remove them. During her 1995 trial, her defense painted a picture of a deeply depressed young woman who had contemplated ending her own life, claiming she might have intended to die alongside her children. Prosecutors, however, argued that the act was deliberate and calculated, a cold, premeditated decision driven by selfish desire. The jury took just 2.5 hours to deliver the verdict: guilty. Susan was spared the death penalty but sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Her children's father, David Smith, who had initially stood by her, was left to grapple with devastation and betrayal. Over the years, he has remained vocal in opposing her parole, emphasizing the irreparable harm her actions caused, asserting that she had never shown genuine remorse. Susan's time in prison has been marred by controversy, including disciplinary actions for inappropriate relationships with guards and drug possession. When she became eligible for parole in November 2024, the board denied it, ensuring that she remains behind bars. The lives of Michael and Alexander, so brutally cut short, serve as a haunting reminder of innocence lost, trust shattered, and the unimaginable darkness that can hide behind a tearful plea. On March 24, 1944, in the small town of Alkaloo, South Carolina, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was playing outside with his younger sister, Amy. It was an ordinary day until 2 young white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, approached them, searching for wildflowers and asking for help. George and Amy didn't know where to look, and the girls eventually moved on. But that evening, when Betty and Mary failed to return home, the town erupted in panic and a community-wide search began. George and his family joined in, with George mentioning he had seen the girls earlier that day, a seemingly innocent statement that would seal his fate. The following morning, the girls' bodies were found in a shallow ditch, their lives brutally taken. Almost immediately, George was accused of the crime. Authorities claimed he had confessed to using a blunt object and committing inappropriate acts, yet there was no written confession, no formal record, no witnesses, and no physical evidence linking him to the murders. George was small and frail, standing just 5'1" and weighing only 95 pounds. He was interrogated alone for hours, with no parent or lawyer present. Whether his alleged confession was voluntary or forced remains unknown, but it set the stage for one of the most troubling miscarriages of justice in American history. Less than a month later, on April 24, 1944, his trial began. It lasted only 3 hours. His court-appointed attorney, a tax lawyer with no criminal experience, offered no defense, called no witnesses, and failed to investigate George's alibi. On June 16, 1944, less than 2 months after his conviction, George Stinney Jr. was executed in the electric chair. At 14, he became the youngest person in modern U.S. history to face such a fate. The chair, built for adults, was far too large for his tiny frame. Officers propped a Bible under him to elevate him. The securing straps hung loosely, and the face mask was oversized. Witnesses later described the horrifying scene. The mask slipped, revealing the terrified face of a child in his final moments. His family was devastated, forced to flee town due to threats and racial hostility, leaving George alone and defenseless in his last hours. For decades, his case remained largely forgotten, yet his family and civil rights advocates never gave up fighting for justice. Renewed efforts began in 2004, arguing that George had been denied a fair trial and that his constitutional rights had been violated. Finally, in December 2014, a South Carolina Circuit Court judge vacated his conviction, acknowledging the complete failure of the justice system, the coerced confession, the lack of legal representation, and the absence of investigation, all cited as reasons. For George's family, it was a bittersweet victory. Relief that his name was cleared, but sorrow that no justice could undo the suffering he endured. George Stinney Jr.'s story is a haunting reminder of the deep racial injustices of the segregated South. Though his name has been cleared, the tragedy of his short, wrongfully taken life continues to resonate, serving as a call to protect those who cannot defend themselves and to demand fairness and justice for all. In January 2016, the ancient Chinese city of Shiion, famous for its terracotta warriors and layers of history, was gripped by a modern horror that no one could have imagined. Behind the concrete and glass of a high-rise apartment building, a quiet tragedy was unfolding, unseen, unheard, and slowly turning fatal. What happened there would expose not just a single failure, but a devastating chain of neglect, isolation, and human indifference. Wu, a woman believed to be in her late 30s or early 40s, lived alone on the 15th floor of the building. She kept to herself, leading a largely unnoticed life. Neighbors rarely saw her. Reports later suggested she struggled with mental illness, but in a place crowded with people, her solitude drew no attention. On January 30th, 2016, the elevator in Wu's building malfunctioned, grinding to a stop between the 10th and 11th floors. Inside the stalled metal box, Wu was trapped. Maintenance workers were called, but what happened next would seal her fate. Instead of opening the elevator or checking inside the cab, the workers reportedly knocked on the doors and shouted, listening for a response. Hearing nothing, they assumed the elevator was empty. They cut the power and left for the Lunar New Year holiday. The doors never opened, the elevator never moved, and Wu was still inside. For more than 30 days, she remained trapped in total darkness, sealed in a narrow steel coffin suspended between floors. No food, no water, no way out. Investigators later described horrifying details. Scratch marks clawed into the elevator walls, her hands badly injured from desperate attempts to pry her way free. Every hour, every day, the situation grew more unbearable. Thirst set in first, then starvation. Alone and terrified, Wu slowly weakened, her cries never heard, her absence unnoticed. It wasn't until March 1st, over a month later, that workers returned to repair the elevator. When they finally opened the doors, they were met with a nightmare. Wu's decomposed body lay slumped inside the cab. The sight sent shockwaves through the building and across the nation. A woman had vanished into plain sight, and no one had realized until it was far too late. Police ruled out foul play, but classified the death as the result of gross negligence. The two maintenance workers who shut down the elevator were arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter. Public outrage erupted. Residents of the building protested against the property management company, describing years of ignored complaints, broken elevators, and dangerously poor maintenance. One resident, surnamed Ding, said the incident left a permanent shadow on his heart, an unshakable fear that something so horrific could happen without anyone noticing. Questions haunted the public. How could someone be missing for over a month without neighbors or staff raising alarms? While Wu's family had reported her missing, they believed she had wandered off, and no urgent search followed. The timing of the Lunar New Year only deepened the anger. While services often slow during the holiday, critics argued that abandoning a broken elevator for weeks went far beyond holiday delays. It was a symptom of a culture that cut corners and placed convenience above human life.